Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Tonight, we're exploring the crucial topic, the future of plastics, reducing waste, and rethinking materials. Sponsored by Kia. To begin, please join me in welcoming to the stage Newsweek's Environment and Sustainability Editor, Jeff Young.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much for being here at Newsweek's New York headquarters. And for those of you joining us via live stream, thank you as well. I'm sure this is going to be an interesting and engaging and even inspiring conversation. We have a great panel lined up. It is also a very important conversation about what is arguably one of our greatest environmental challenges. Plastic pollution not only is clogging our waterways, killing marine wildlife, it's also contributing mightily to the greenhouse gases that are warming our atmosphere. It's also a threat to human health, as we will learn in our discussion this evening. So it's a very important topic. It's also very timely. You may have heard that there was recently talks in Busan, South Korea, in an attempt to get a treaty, a UN treaty, to rein in plastic waste. We will hear very much more from that from our panelists, three of whom were actually in Busan for the treaty talks. But first, I want to welcome to the stage Newsweek's Chief Strategy Officer, Diane Kandapa.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of our CEO, Dev Bragad, our Global Editor-in-Chief, Nancy Cooper, and all of us at Team Newsweek, welcome to the Future of Plastics, a Newsweek Hope event. Now, if I had a earpiece on, my producer would have been shouting at me saying, Diane, you've messed up the title of the event. It's a Newsweek Horizons event, not a Hope event. But after the events of Busan, I think we're all gathered here in the name of hope. The media coverage after Busan was quite dispiriting. It seemed like once again, the most capable species ever to inhabit this planet was shrinking from the challenge of saving it. The doomsday statistics have been piling up. Take a look behind me. What you see outside the window is New York City from the 72nd floor of the World Trade Center. In the graphic over there is also New York City. It's the little tiny white pile at the bottom of the Blue Mountain. And that Blue Mountain is all of the plastic waste that we will produce between now and 2050 in the absence of an agreement like Busan. That could be the future of plastics. Now, you're all gathered here because you hope in a different future. But hope is not a strategy. Still, there's no point in a strategy without hope. Take our sponsors this evening, Kia. You know, the Hyundai Motor Group has invested its corporate purpose, its time, and its capital in the seemingly hopeless task of cleaning the world's oceans of plastic. In that process, they've made a difference, and they've inspired others to action. You know, I've been doing this a while, and it's very rare that you get to thank a sponsor for something more than the cocktail reception. So can we give Kia a big round of applause, please, ladies and gentlemen? Well, that's Kia. But what does Newsweek know about the future of plastics? To be honest, apart from Jeff, very little. But we do know a little bit about moments like Busan. You know, we've been in the publishing business for about 92 years, and in that time, we've seen moments of setback that are far graver than Busan, and opportunities that emerge after them that are far more promising than what we hoped for. We were there at Pearl Harbor, and then there in Tokyo Bay on the battleship Missouri. We were there at the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and there at the inauguration of Barack Obama. We were there when the Brandenburg Gate was shut, and there when the Berlin Wall was torn down. And as a print publication that somehow managed to make it through the digital age and convene a gathering as esteemed as this in an era of thinking machines, the 21st century history of Newsweek is littered with Busan moments of our own. We know that if you step back from the setback and convene a group of people committed to a strategy of hope, the view over the horizon can look quite different. Let's take a look at that graphic again. Scientists have found a way to reduce that blue mountain by 90% between now and 2050. That would make it roughly the size of the little New York City you see on the graphic at the bottom. That could also be the future of plastics. Thank you all for sharing the hope. Welcome once again to this Newsweek Horizons event, and we really do hope you enjoy the view. Thank you.
Thank you, Diane. And let's bring our panelists to the stage. First, we have Dr. Leonardo Tresande. Dr. Tresande is from the Grossman School of Medicine at New York University, where, among other things, he directs the NYU Center for the Investigation of Environmental Hazards. Welcome. Jonathan Quinn is CEO of the U.S. Plastics Pact. Aaron Simon is Vice President and Head of Plastic Waste and Business for the World Wildlife Fund. Jessica Long, Chief Strategy Officer and Head of Closed Loop Builders at Closed Loop Partners. And Allison Lin, Global Vice President of Packaging Sustainability from Mars, Inc. Thank you all so much. Let's have a seat and get into it. Well, thanks again, everyone, for making the trip here, especially to those of you who came halfway around the world after traveling halfway around the world in the other direction to participate in the INC5, I think it's called, the treaty talks. We're going to start with some observations about what happened in Busan, what didn't happen in Busan, and what might lie ahead. And I want to start with you, Aaron, because I know World Wildlife, in addition to the work that you do for WWF, you've also organized this business coalition to press for a strong treaty, and you've been involved with the treaty process, I'm guessing, from the get-go. What are your top-line takeaways from what just happened between just before Thanksgiving and the 1st of December in South Korea?
Yeah, so I think we were disappointed to walk away without a strong treaty. However, it doesn't mean the week was a failure. So what we saw last week for the first time in the process was this mobilization of a progressive majority. What has really been problematic throughout the entire INC process has been this sort of desire to stick to this practice of consensus, which in theory is great, right? That we come together as a global community, we all agree, we move forward. But on these really complicated and sometimes divisive issues, that can be really hard. And it's especially hard when consensus is weaponized and used as a tactic to slow progress. So for the first 4 INCs, we hadn't really seen that majority, which there is a very progressive majority that is demanding a treaty that has a lot of teeth that can really help us to solve this crisis. We hadn't really seen that mobilized. And so last week we saw that starting on day 1 with the adoption of the chair's non-paper. And then while we didn't get to that treaty that we wanted to, what we saw in the last few days, really in the last 3 days, was this mobilization of that majority again to through press conferences, through longer speeches on the floor with Rwanda and Mexico really talking about almost 100 states each in focusing on the need for mandatory phase-outs and elimination of products and chemicals of concern and targets for reduction. And that was really a big deal. And so when we left there with the starting point for negotiation at INC 5.2 being a text that was delivered on Sunday, it has the good bones for us to negotiate moving forward, to get all the things we need to have in it around these mandatory sort of obligations. And And if that progressive majority continues to keep the pressure on, I think we have a chance in 5.2 of getting the treaty we really need.
Jonathan, to you next. The Plastics Pact, in a similar fashion, has brought together companies from all across the value chain of plastics to come up with ways to reduce plastic waste, to improve the circularity of the whole economy of plastics. You've developed this roadmap for accomplishing that, and I'm wondering, did you see things happening with the treaty process, either in South Korea or leading up to the South Korean talks, that reflect the roadmap goals and the kind of policies that the pact has been advancing?
Yeah, I think right out the gate, Aaron mentioned it, but we have what's known as our problematic and unnecessary materials list. And this is a list that has very close alignment with the treaty itself. And so that's one of the key highlights. That's a function of all of our activators, is what we refer to as our members, who are truly activating the plastic circular economy. And that's what the pact is all about bringing everybody together in order to enable true progress towards that plastic circular economy. And as a function of our roadmap, one of the key targets of that roadmap is to eliminate those materials that are listed as problematic and unnecessary. And so those people that are part of our membership, they make up and they will drive towards that plastic circular economy and have direct correlation and alignment with the treaty. And so because we're able to bring the entire industry from literally from pellet to policy is kind of what I say, and everything in between, whether it's the producers of resin or whether it's brand owners, retailers, government agencies, municipalities, recyclers, we bring all those together. And because there's uniform consensus within the pact around that materials list, that is a fundamental, I think, supporter of the treaty and how it can continue to create that progress.
Thank you. Allison, this seems like a good time to come to you because Mars, if I understand correctly, your company is a member of both an activator with the pact and a member of the coalition that Aaron represents. Tell me a little about that and the ambitious goals that Mars has set and how that relates to the treaty process. How would a successful treaty help your company achieve these goals?
Yeah, first, it's been really amazing to be part of both of these organizations because they are galvanizing action at both the national and global level around tackling plastic pollution across the whole value chain. And the business coalition that you mentioned, that WWF and the Ellen MacArthur Foundation have convened, is now over 280 plus organizations across industry, recyclers, waste management, financial institutions. And it's been really amazing to be part of this really large group, all calling for a really ambitious treaty, being able to be a resource for government, a resource to the negotiators on what business wants to see in an ambitious treaty, and frankly, being a voice of ambition from the business community. So it's been a really amazing process to be part of that. In terms of what we were hoping to get out of INC 5 and the treaty and how that could impact us and our goals, like Aaron said, we were also hoping for a resolution and a treaty coming out of INC 5, but we would much rather have a little bit more, not a lot, a little bit more time to get to a really strong treaty with global obligations than a weak, watered-down treaty. Because what could happen with a weak treaty is we get a lot of fragmentation and lack of harmonization around global rules, which is what's happening today. It's really difficult for global companies to drive scale, drive economies of scale, figure out where to invest when there's a lot of different regulations around the world. As a company, we want to understand what regulations are going to look like, ideally drive harmonized regulation that we know will actually tackle the problem of plastic pollution, and have standardized product design, phase outs of problematic materials and chemicals of concerns, reduction of plastic, looking at what sustainable production levels look like. And we want all of that in a strong treaty. Having a watered down treaty, we'd much rather have a little bit more time than having a watered down treaty that does not address those, because it makes it a lot more difficult for business than, again, to leverage scale and drive solutions. If we are able to get a good global treaty out of this, then we, again, can figure out where to invest. And it's not only good for big companies and international companies. Economies of scale will help small and medium-sized enterprises also move to alternative solutions, sustainable materials, have more predictability on where to invest and put their resources, because they don't have the resources that large companies have. So it's not only good for large companies, but also good for small companies. And I, for one, am frankly glad that we're taking a little bit more time and have a stronger treaty text going into INC 5.2 versus going to a weak, watered-down treaty.
Well, this is an interesting perspective that I hear emerging here that I think is somewhat at odds with the headlines that I wrote and others covering this wrote. There's like, oh, it melted down, no treaty, it was a failure. But it's another step in the process, is what I'm hearing.
It's about progress over perfection.
Very well put. Thank you. So, Jessica, I want to come to you next. And by the way, I should mention extra thanks to you for pinch hitting tonight. We were originally going to have Ron Gonen at your organization, fell ill. We wish him a speedy recovery, and very grateful to have you here in his stead. Tell us a bit about how Closed Loop Partners operates in this space and how the kind of work that you're investing in would be affected by a treaty outcome.
Definitely, and first of all, thank you so much for allowing me to step in last minute. Closed Loop Partners is a firm focused on investing in and building the circular economy. And as many people know, the circular economy is a key pillar of the Global Plastics Treaty. And the key being the focus on the economy, the circular economy, right? It's a new economic model, a new business model for how we should treat all materials that we use in production and consumption. It essentially gets rid of the notion of waste altogether. So instead of a linear take, make, waste economy, we will have a take, make economy, getting rid of that concept of waste altogether. At Closed Loop, to your question, we focus on everything from investing in new business models that maybe get rid of the need for plastics or get rid of the need for packaging altogether, especially some of the problematic plastics that you mentioned earlier. We're also focusing on business models that reduce the need for single use or reduce the need for materials being shipped all across the country or all across the world, which is what we have in today's systems. We also have an innovation center that is focused on some of the biggest bottlenecks in our system today. So looking at everything like behavioral change needed for reuse systems, which we think is a critical part of a circular economy and a critical part of reduction of plastic waste as part of the Global Plastics Treaty. And then we have a company called Closed Loop Builders that is literally focused on building out the infrastructure and the systems needed to keep materials back in our supply chains and our value chains. We hear a lot, as you said, on kind of headlines out there saying things like recycling doesn't work, or the systems today are broken. I truly don't think that's the case. I think they're just not effective or not as effective as they could be, and they're definitely not at scale. So we believe strongly that there is an economic model here that makes more sense than a linear economy, than a wasteful take, make, waste economy. And we believe strongly that if you invest properly across those different business models, those different pieces of infrastructure, you're actually going to get a higher return. And it's better for our economy, it's better for the environment.
Well, thank you. And we will get more into recycling soon. I can promise you that. That's a big issue, obviously. Leo.
Yep.
I want to say Dr. Trisande.
Please.
Leo, I've saved you for the final question in this first round here because you come at this from a slightly different perspective, and that is from the human health impact. A lot of you've done really groundbreaking work identifying how some of the chemicals in plastics affect our bodies, especially in the development of young people and contributions to disease. What progress have you seen so far in this treaty process? You're an official observer in the treaty process. What progress have you seen to address that, to move this from just talking about waste to talking about the broader suite of concerns about plastics?
So just as context, it's important to think about this from the perspective of science diplomacy. So when I think of this process compared to the Montreal Protocol that kept us from having a hole in our ozone layer, independent science drove the development of those protocols. and produced a stellar outcome that pays out for our economy and for human health to this day. When I think about the current outcome of INC 5, it's really a byproduct of independent science not driving the process in an effective way. We do have robust scientific evidence that chemicals used in plastic hack our hormones, our signaling molecules underlying temperature, metabolism, salt, sugar, and even sex. And we know that not only do these chemicals harm our health from cradle to grave, they harm our economy. They cost the United States $250 billion in disease-related costs each year, 1.2% of the gross domestic product. So when I observe the process of the treaty from before the first INC meeting in Dakar in Senegal, about 2 years ago now, time flies. We've seen a massive shift towards health being a predominant part of the agenda. And if I have to point out heroes in the process of INC 5 in particular, the Latin American countries really pushed a clarion call for health being a crucial principle. If we are going to have an effective treaty, and I'm glad the treaty process is stalled in a way, because I do agree with everyone here that we are going to have a better treaty if we work out our issues. We're going to need to see reductions in production, chemical lists of concern that are robust, actions that don't rely solely on consensus as a principle for execution of the treaty. And ultimately, we need independent science to carry the day. We need conflicts of interest to be disclosed, and we need the best available science to inform the process.
And thank you for mentioning the Montreal Protocol, because I think it's an important example of, hey, we can solve problems, even very challenging problems at the global scale. Once in a while, I'll hear people who are, somewhat skeptical of climate change. They'll say, well, you never hear anything about that ozone hole anymore. It's like, well, yeah, that's because we listened to the scientists and we solved it. Wouldn't we like to do that again with some of our other environmental challenges? So kudos for that mention. But the key policy levers that you're talking about there really are about the chemicals of concern and some sort of a cap on overall production of plastic, which, as I understand it, those were the chief difficulties that led to the moment of stalemate in Busan. Aaron, I'm going to come back to you first on this, but others might want to weigh in here. Tell us more about why a limit on the production of plastics is important and how it intersects with the other type of policy objectives that you want to achieve here in terms of boosting recycling and improving waste collection, et cetera.
Yeah, I think it's always good to just start with the waste hierarchy, right? We start by reduction first, but it's also just really simple when you think about it. Today, we are producing so much plastic that we have a dump truck of plastic pollution entering our oceans every minute. And the latest studies, and it could be even more than this, is that we will double production in the next 15 years and then triple the amount that is entering our ecosystems. So that's 3 dump trucks a minute. And we can't manage that right now with infrastructure, with recycling, with reuse. Like we just can't. And so anybody who says we can just solve this with waste management and thinks we are going to catch up and be able to double that management in the next 15 years, I think is really assuming more than we are probably capable of doing. So I think we start with reduction, right? And so how do you target that reduction, right? How do we all agree as a global community, what do we get rid of? Well, you want to get rid of the things that are the most problematic and harmful in the first place. So let's start with these lists of chemicals that we know are causing harms to humans. Let's start with these products that are really problematic and can't actually be recycled in the first place and are hard to reuse. And this first step, that targeted reduction, is the key to that non-toxic circular economy. Any of you in here who know about supply chain building, right? You would never have a full supply chain and not develop a procurement policy that said, the stuff that can go into my manufacturing facility can be anything you want. And I will still have a good business on the back end of that, right? Imagine if we want to put these non-toxic circular economy infrastructure everywhere in the world, we have to have a procurement policy. We have to say what can go in it. And it certainly needs to be transparent. It certainly needs to be safe for human health. And it certainly needs to be made up of things that can be made into other things that have a high economic value. So all of the other key elements of the treaty are all dependent on this reduction first. And from an economic perspective, that's where you get the biggest bang for your buck, right? You get the greatest impact for the lowest cost by starting with reduction. And so that is why it's really important that those are key elements to how we get to that hopeful target that is in Article 6 right now, fully bracketed, for what we could start with reduction. And I think when you have that and you have that transparency and you let an independent scientific body drive what goes on those lists, we have a much greater chance of being successful overall in sort of reducing the impact of plastic through its entire life cycle, as the resolution and the mandate states right now.
Well, I know there's a lot more to address there. Jonathan, you want to jump in on that? Or?
Yeah, no,
Yeah, okay.
I just wanted to echo kind of what Aaron was saying, and the reduction is key. And I think this doesn't often happen where I get to sit next to somebody else who went to school for packaging, just like I did. So we went to school and we understand the science and fact behind material selection and where there's opportunities to reduce and where there's opportunities to swap out and exchange materials that ultimately still provide shelf life, still provide and enable products to get to the consumers the way they need to. But at the end of the day, we've talked about the science and fact, and that is what the pact is focused on, is being based on science and fact and true data. And I want to commend you because as a reporter, you've done a tremendous job, and some of you may have seen the article, but I think today one of the biggest challenges is the misinformation and the misuse of non-scientific and factual-based data that happens, and you, Newsweek, have done a tremendous job of focusing on that data, and it's evident as by this conversation.
Oh, thank you so much. Remind me to send you that check after. Kidding. Oh, it feels like we're ready to talk about recycling now because we've kind of been mentioning it, leading up to it. It's one of the questions I get most often as an environmental reporter is something about recycling, and I'm often flummoxed in trying to answer them because it's variable from where you live, et cetera. There's a lot of frustration, I think, among the public about recycling, the gap between the potential for recycling and what we actually see happening or not happening. Some polling, I think, really supports that and points to that. Some of it, Aaron, from your group, the WWF, found 81% of respondents said they want to recycle and reuse more plastic, but 1 in 7 respondents said they lacked access to adequate recycling services. That was from a few years ago. Just last month, the group Keep America Beautiful, which is a pro-recycling, anti-litter group, found that 63% of people in their survey, when asked to grade recycling, A, B, C, et cetera, gave it a C or lower, 22% rating it a D or F. It doesn't sound like we're doing great. I want to go down the line here. This is a fill-in-the-blank question. So I'm looking for like 1, 2 words. When I say plastic recycling in the U.S. today is, you fill in the blank with?
Unhealthy.
Unhealthy.
We know that chemicals.
That's more than one word.
Oh, I was going to explain the word. Yeah.
We'll come back. We'll come back for
Okay,
that. We'll come back
sounds
for that. Fill in the blank. Plastic recycling in the U.S. today is?
Maturing.
Maturing. Aaron?
Broken?
Okay.
I'd say promising. That's my optimistic view of this.
It's currently inefficient but developing.
Okay. So let's come back to where we started here. Unhealthy. Plastic recycling is unhealthy.
So we know that materials obtained if you drink from a recycled plastic water bottle, right now you have a higher risk of metal exposure as well as bisphenols and phthalates. And that's no fault of the system. It's taking trash, if you will, and incorporating all of the different streams of exposure and integrating it. There was a study recently also documenting, for example, those black plastic silverwares that we see all on the shelves having extremely high levels of brominated flame retardants, chemicals that have largely been phased out of furniture. So we have to tackle the chemical exposure issue when we talk about solutions on behalf of human health.
So this is interesting. I misunderstood you when you said unhealthy. I thought you were referring to like the state of recycling was unhealthy, but you're talking about the actual materials. This in turn naturally points back to the need for the chemicals of concern to be addressed and therefore make the recycled plastic at least less dangerous that way. Okay. Jonathan, you referenced this. You have a lot of experience in the plastics packaging industry. Based on that, as well as your father, I should mention, this is a family, intergenerational business for you. Tell me about the importance of product design and how much that is going to affect whether or not we are able to make plastic recycling more effective.
The key, to your point, this is the future and the evolution of what I hope that we are able to achieve is, and why I care so much is because I grew up around it. But because of that, I'm passionate about making things better, making it change. But ultimately, when it comes to packaging design and developing materials, the materials are out there. The materials are there to make an impact, to enable the transition away from PFAS. That is a very viable and real, tangible thing that can be done today. But companies have to make the commitment. Like all of our activators, they've made that commitment. They've set forth that they're going to be transparent and clearly display or share their progress that they're making in regards to eliminating these materials. And we're about to publish a report again next week about the progress we've made. These changes can be made. That is a fact. And it's about making the commitment, and it's making the financial commitment all of these companies have to do in order to make it possible.
Thank you. Aaron, broken was your term?
Broken.
Expand on that a little, and as you do, help us understand how we pay to fix it. Who's going to pay to make this work better?
So I think it's broken because it's sort of not set up for success, right? If I was to think about what I need recycling systems to do or a reuse system to do is to perpetuate sort of the cascading value of that material, right? So it needs to head into some sort of infrastructure, it needs to be collected, and then it needs to be processed so it can be high quality, and then it needs to be bought again or used again. And today it's cheaper to send things to landfill than it is to recycle. So if you don't have a solid buyer for that material, you're certainly going to just send it to landfill. Also, there's no transparency to what you're getting. So you wouldn't know if there was chemicals of concern in there at all because you're just getting a lot of plastic. A lot of it is colored or has weird labels or additives that you don't know that can degrade the quality of what you do recycle because there is no agreed upon design standards for how we do that. And then, of course, you're dependent on public funding or dependent on whatever funding your municipality has. And that is not always driven towards the outcome of getting things recycled. It's sometimes driven towards the outcome of managing waste. And so what we need to do to fix the broken recycling system and to move into a non-toxic recycling system is to set up the enabling conditions, right? First and foremost, you need to have design guidelines. What can go in there, what can't? And a requirement of, as you report what you're putting onto the market, transparency in it. Then you need to have good policies. And extended producer responsibility is currently seen as the best policy to date. It is one that is even being included in the treaty. But what it can do is it can shift that burden off of the public and shift that burden off of public local governments to the private sector. And then they can be the ones who are designing these materials towards these guidelines, and they can pay a fee to get it recycled based on how well they designed it. That's where we get into this term we call eco-modulation or fee modulation. Basically, if you design that efficiently, then you pay a certain price. But if you add something to it, like a chemical of concern, and there needs to be PPE in the facility, that's going to cost you more. If you make it black or a color that's going to degrade the quality of the recycled content, that's going to cost you more. So you're economically disincentivized to make it wrong. You could also be economically incentivized to use less, to use more recycled content, et cetera, et cetera. So that fee helps pay for the infrastructure, helps to make sure the infrastructure is performing for the greatest efficiency material to material. And then ultimately, that EPR system can be measuring outcomes. And so obviously that outcome will be like, how much product did you sell? But what about energy efficiency for these technologies, right? There's a lot of talk about chemical recycling, which is currently very unproven and very high energy and could cause as many problems as existing chemical production in the first place. So you should have standards of outcomes so that if you are going to be technology neutral in that policy, that you can say it has to be energy efficient, has to meet a certain energy level, and air, water, and soil emissions, so that you can be allowing innovation to happen, but guided towards these environmental and human health outcomes, but ultimately creating the policies and the enabling conditions you need for recycling to work.
Great.
Can I just make one
Sure.
build off of that and ask you this? I think one of the fundamentals and the keys of that financing is really tied to domestic sourcing requirements associated to recycled content, making sure that we're helping to encourage recycled content coming from the domestic market so it can help those overall fundamental economics. Because if we don't force and we don't create responsible end markets in the economy in which we operate, the wheels kind of fall off.
Yeah, I mean, I do think it drives that demand for that recycled content and that commitment to buy it, which is lacking right now also. It creates some more resiliency. Nobody really wants to buy recycled content from other countries and ship it all the way over here either. I think it's nice to have that more local. So yeah, I think that is another factor. If we fix the broken system today, there's a lot of benefit that economics, jobs, better products, better quality materials, and the ability to gain all of that value out of those materials we're throwing away right now.
And control over the performance of those materials.
Yep.
Jessica, I think your word was hopeful or promising?
Promising.
Promising,
Yeah.
Okay. And Closed Loop Partners, you have a pretty direct hand in recycling, especially by virtue of your ownership of Circular Services. This is one of, if not the biggest recycling company in the country. Tell us about how you see recycling improving, given your direct experience there.
Well, first of all, I want to just remind us all that if you look at the broader circular economy, recycling is one part of it. And I know we touched on that at the beginning, but I think it's always good to constantly remind ourselves that, and the panelists, I think, have all talked about this, that remove is very important. So removing those things that are harmful or don't have economic value in our system is really important. Reducing things that both fit into that first category, as well as things that maybe do have value but are more single use or don't need to be used at all or have an inappropriate form or function. So think about a lot of single-use utensils, for example, right? So a lot of things could be in that reduce category. And then reuse is extremely important. So kind of going back, we were talking earlier about like going back to the way things used to be when reuse was a pretty normal thing. So bringing back reuse in a very healthy economic model. And then when you get to recycling, the reason I said promising, or it could be hopeful as well, is where it works, and there are many great examples of where recycling in general works across the country, it works really well. I mean, you look at least the facilities that we run or the facilities that we invest in, you're seeing recycling capture rates through the facility in the 80s and 90%, right? Meaning you're able now with great technologies, AI and robotics, opticals, eddy currents, and others to really appropriately sort out good materials so that they can go back into a supply chain. And that's critical, this last part of, can I sort materials so that they can go back into a useful supply chain? And that kind of gets to Aaron's point about eco-modulation. There has to be value to that material and value to keeping it in our system. Otherwise, in our mind, are you really recycling, or are you just preventing it from going into a landfill? And I think that's really important. But again, I say promising because where it works, and there are great examples of communities with extremely high recycling rates and extremely high capture rates because they have a good system in place. I think part of the challenge is a lot of what you've already heard, a lot of what Aaron just talked about in terms of we don't have the right or enough infrastructure in place, especially on the collection side and on the sortation side, to bring that material in. Fortunately, we have a ton of demand. Like, there's more, and this goes back to this point, Jonathan, that you brought up of materials being shipped in from overseas, because there's a ton of demand for recycled content, but not all recycled content or not all materials have that same level of demand. But we have enough demand that we should be building the right collection infrastructure, the right sortation infrastructure, and the right processing infrastructure to turn that material back into packaging or back into the best and highest use. So that's why I think it's promising, because from an economics perspective, totally makes sense when you're talking about materials that have value in our supply chain. From a local community, job creation, local economy perspective, totally makes sense when you're able to keep those materials as local or as regional as possible. Again, not shipping things all over the place, which has really negative environmental and economic impacts to that material getting moved over. And then it totally makes sense in terms of just our ways of working and living. When we talk about reducing plastic production, which was one of your earlier questions, can we reduce the amount of stuff that we extract? You have to keep in mind that we send hundreds of millions of tons of material, valuable material, to landfills in the US every year. So if you want to say, how do we reduce what's out there? One thing is to mine the materials from those landfills, right? Keep materials in circulation. And that's, again, I'd say promising because the model works when we have the right infrastructure in place, the right incentives in place, and the right economics in place.
Allison, give us some examples of how Mars is approaching these other issues that we've heard the other panelists address here when it comes to the kind of packaging and making them more able to be recycled, et cetera.
Yeah, so I just want to echo what all the panelists have said about the waste hierarchy, because first you need to reduce what you don't need. And that's for all materials, right? If you don't need it, is there a way to reuse it? Is there a way to eliminate it completely? And then is there a way to simplify it so that it can be easier to recycle, so that it uses less energy? I do think, if we look at recycling, Aaron mentioned extended producer responsibility or EPR, and there's countries in the world where EPR has been in place for over 30 years. We're just starting to see it come in the US for the first time over the past couple of years, I think enacted the first time next year. And a country like Belgium has had EPR for 30 years, and they have plastics recycling rates of 60%, which is extremely high. I think that would be a dream in the US. Mm-hmm. And part of this treaty process, and if we get good language on EPR, there's a potential for developing countries to potentially leapfrog the US if we don't adopt some of these EPR policies that we know work in other countries. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. We can see what has worked well in other countries. What have they learned over those 30 years, including eco-modulation, including producer pays? How do we leverage all the learnings and build some of these systems for the developing countries as well as in the US so that we can have better functioning systems? But again, it has to be grounded in the waste hierarchy, where we first reduce what we don't need, then redesign for better circularity, and that could be recycling, reuse, or composting. And then invest. So we need the investment in partnerships and funds in recycled content. We need to invest in all that to be able to continue to the circle and drive the circular economy that you mentioned. So if we look at all of that together in EPR, it can actually help with the whole waste hierarchy. So if EPR is designed well, it can incentivize you to reduce the materials, because no one wants to pay for more than you need, right? It can incentivize you to move to better materials that have more value, and it can incentivize you to move to reuse and refill models. So really well-designed EPR, which is, again, something that we're really fighting for to be strongly mentioned in the treaty. Of course, recognizing that different nations are at different places with their waste management infrastructure. But having the strong language can actually address the whole waste hierarchy, not just the recycling portion. And that's a lot of what we're focusing on at Mars, looking at the waste hierarchy, looking at supporting good, well-designed EPR, and then redesigning our packaging to fit that EPR system.
You know, I want to just briefly, we're running a little short on time, but just briefly I want to touch on reuse. I live in Louisville, Kentucky, great town, not exactly on the cutting edge of social change, but even in little old Louisville, I can walk down the street to a place called the Refillery. Shout out to the Refillery on Douglas Loop, they're doing a great job. We can take our little bottles back there and get our shampoo and liquid soap and cleaning supplies. It's a very appealing model, but I'm wondering how scalable is it? And Jessica, a question for you, because I know Closed Loop has been involved with a very interesting reuse project in, is it Petaluma in California? Tell me about what you've learned about whether that sort of thing can scale up to meet the size of the problem.
I mean, it's very early days because we've just concluded a 3-month pilot in Petaluma, California, to your point, looking at implementing a reuse model across multiple different businesses, involving multiple different partners. Overall, again, I'm extremely excited about the early results. I'll just say it's been about 3 months. There's only like 60,000 people, I think, is the population of Petaluma, and we've had over 220,000 returns of those cups, that we're using during that reuse pilot in Petaluma. A big part of our focus is on design. So to everybody that's been talking about design, what kind of messaging, what kind of marketing, what kind of systems, and by systems I mean the boxes that cups would go back into, the washing systems and sanitation systems that would be needed to ensure those cups are ready to go back out, the education and marketing that's needed to ensure that people know what to do and prefer that the reuse, and ultimately to get to a point where reuse is the norm. So our goal going into this wasn't something where it's, okay, you can get single use, but also reuse is an option. We wanted reuse to be the norm in this Petaluma pilot. And I think the early results, we'll have the full results out early in 2025, but the early results, again, I'd say are very promising because it's showing that at the end of the day, people want to do the right thing. People don't want to create more waste. And I think that's really important. People don't want to create more waste. They are looking for solutions. They are looking for systems. They are looking for things that are easy at the end of the day that will allow them to participate in solutions and economies that, again, don't produce more waste and make a lot of sense. So early days still, but I think there's a lot of initial proof points that say reuse can definitely work and can definitely be scalable.
Super. So we're getting close to the end of time. I have one final question for all of you. A reminder, we're going to have questions from the audience, and I know there's a lot of expertise in this audience, so I'm looking forward to some good questions. No pressure, but looking for good questions. My final question, though, and this is partly because I feel like we need a dose of hope, referring back to Diane's comments and that image that we saw, that giant tower. You know, this is the tallest building in the Western Hemisphere, and you could barely see it next to that pile of plastic that we might produce. That's one possible future. I'm wondering, and Allison, just for variety's sake, I want to start from your end this time. Briefly, what gives you hope that we can reduce that giant blue blob from becoming our plastic's future?
Yeah, I wish we could have a word cloud throughout the INC process, because it's amazing to see the conversations that are happening in INC for those that are trying to make progress within the plastics treaty. You're seeing a progression and a better understanding and education for everyone across the whole system, the negotiators, NGOs, industry, financial institutions, on what it takes to address plastic pollution. And every INC, we've seen that maturing. So that gives me hope. The fact that we've been able to hold 3,000 people captive in these sessions focus really just on plastic pollution, and we're hearing from all parts of the from all voices throughout the solution and being able to talk to each other about what are the possible solutions we could look at. That gives me hope. And we've really seen that mature throughout the system, even through INC 5. And we're starting to see that progress through national level legislation too. So that treaty process itself has really helped accelerate good legislation to address plastic pollution.
Super. Jessica.
I'd say the main thing that gives me hope in terms of that picture and actually reducing that big blue pyramid by 90% is we know the answers to this problem. Like, all the solutions exist. This isn't one of those problems out there that we have to rack our brains and get all the experts together and say, what do we do here? To the comments earlier, we have the data, we have the science, we have the business models, we have the innovators, we have the innovations out there that get us to all of those different levers to reduce that volume or that mound that we saw by the 90% goal. So the solutions exist. It's about the will, the incentives, the models, getting people together. And the last piece I'll say about that, around why I'm hopeful about getting folks together, is actually the comments that were made at the beginning, which is why it's a good thing that we didn't opt for consensus. It's a good thing that we didn't agree to a weaker treaty or to a non-binding, weaker document that wouldn't actually mean anything, because there was enough belief that we have the solutions, we have the models, we have the people needed to actually solve the problem, and we can have the right treaty in place to do that.
Great. Erin?
Echo a lot of that. But I would say also what in the process of, sort of that moment in 2022 when 175 nations unanimously agreed to solve this problem. And even before that, there has been this sort of wave of momentum around how everybody can take action against it. And that momentum is still going, and it's happening even, as the treaty negotiations stall, right? Because the treaties are creating this sort of framework of what could be on the table. And in the meantime, you see businesses, you see cities and communities and governments, and you see individuals continuing to take action. That is going to still happen. But what gives me the most hope is that throughout this process, you usually see a whittling of the ambition because of compromise and because of the need for consensus. And so what I saw, though, and what we've seen over the last 5 INCs is an increase in ambition. It was almost like countries realized, one, that they wouldn't have to do it alone, that they could do it in partnership with others, partnership with business, and that there was, two, a lot of attraction to how to fund this and create, because there's economic business models to it all, right? There's the ability to have a sustainable business model for these solutions. They're not just a sunk cost. But 3, at this point, we have over 135 countries who are advocating to start with the need to reduce these targeted products and chemicals of concern. And that's huge. That's 135 countries around the world who know that that is what we have to do scientifically, and that's what we need to do. And so whether or not we get the treaty we need this year, that action is still going to happen. Is it as good as it could be? No, because coordinated action is always going to be better, but it's certainly a lot more than we started with in those first rounds of negotiations. So if we keep going at that sort of trajectory, I think we have a lot of possibilities in actually doing what we set out to achieve, which was to end plastic pollution. And
Jonathan?
Yeah, I think I have tremendous excitement and optimism after I wasn't there, but after hearing all the progress that was made, and I think ultimately we're going to get there. This event is the prime example of why we're making progress. It's about not just the policy conversations, we have to also pay attention to consumers, and we have to bring consumers along for the ride, for the journey, and they're a key part of the success of us being able to achieve that. And so we have to give them the systems, we have to give them the infrastructure, we have to give them the packaging and the materials to make that possible and to make their lives more convenient and easier to enable that plastic circular economy. And that's one of the fundamentals that we have to make sure. But at the end of the day, why are we doing this? We're doing this for the next generation. I'm doing this for my kids to enable them to have a world that isn't full of pollution. And the consumers want that. And we need to help them see, and it's through the transparency, it's through the all showing and being very transparent with all that we're doing in order to make and create that progress.
Super, thank you. Leo, you get the last word.
So a European Union delegate at a press conference towards the end of the INC really brought this message home, that the planet has survived for millions of years without us and will survive millions of years without us if we go extinct as a result of plastic pollution. And it's that clarion call for protecting our own health that has really been embraced by Generation Z and the millennials. And to me, the very compelling piece of hope that I hold on to is the fact that the youth delegation at the INC process has had such very strong clout. And particularly the next generation of young scientists that are emerging are really pushing in. They're seeing microplastics and nanoplastics in people. They're seeing chemicals of concern in people. And they're saying, what can we do about it and how can we stop this before we all suffer the consequences, even if we cool the planet?
Thank you all so much. Can I get a round of applause for this fantastic panel? Thank you all so much. Okay, so now it's your turn. Like I said, I know we have a lot of expertise in this room. I'm going to depend on my mic runners to identify some of our questioners. I think we have one over here. And if you can, do me the favor of standing and identifying yourself when you ask your question. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Craig Rosenthal. I wanted to address this to the doctor. My particular interest is in reuse of plastics as opposed to recycling plastics, particularly in the clinical field, the construction field, and certain consumer product fields. You, by virtue of your degree, has probably sat in some very interesting meetings to ascertain in the clinical space what would and would not be permitted with clinical. And my guess is another vote in that would be a products liability lawyer. So has this occurred when you've been in these meetings at NYU? Has NYU's either outside counsel or in-house counsel for products liability specifically chimed in on this?
So let me start, without getting me in trouble with NYU lawyers, by saying that personally and on behalf of the Endocrine Society, who I've represented at the INC process, I'm glad to see the healthcare exemption for this treaty gone forever. And that's crucial because 12% of the plastic industry was going to be allowed a way out and to stay business as usual. Let me be clear that healthcare has been a leader in environmental protection. Think about mercury and medical waste incinerators. We got it out of medical waste incinerators before we got it out of coal-fired power plants. And so healthcare has and will continue to be leaders in this space. Healthcare Without Harm has really brought together thousands of medical organizations to show leadership on climate change, and they're pivoting even more deeply to plastic. And I'm proud that NYU Langone is part of the Project Green Health Network. So I see substantial opportunity for healthcare being the leader rather than the liable.
Let's see, do we have another questioner? Oh, I see a couple up front here, and one toward the back. We'll keep you in mind. But yeah, we'll go to our guest in the green sweater. Yes. And if you can, stand and identify yourself. Thank you so much.
Sure. My name is Grove Harris, and I represent the Temple of Understanding, one of the world's oldest interfaith organizations. So I have an eco-justice mandate, and I really want to appreciate the constructive nature of everything that's going on here. But I'd like to add a little more pressure, if I may, to say that we have a lot of duplicity from the industry, a lot of really lying PR about recycling for decades. And I believe that the price point between using virgin plastic and recycling is huge. So in that framework, let me ask you, what do you think the role is for criminal liability in international courts or in national class action suits, what the usefulness of that might be to redress some of the corporate profiteering.
Well, and is there a specific person you want to address that to? Oh. And just briefly, I mean, there have been some lawsuits just recently. Just in September, for example, the Attorney General for California filed suit against ExxonMobil. The New York suit was tossed out, and then there's a similar suit from Los Angeles County. Who wants to take this one on? Oh, I see. We're eager to jump into this one.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to start. So if you look at, I think one of the things we talk about, this is a circular economy, right? So if we increase supply, right now demand outstrips supply. So naturally, recycled content is going to be more expensive than virgin. And I think, without getting too deep into it, there's also a lot of efficiencies and subsidies we can drive out of the virgin plastic supply chain as well. But we need to improve the recycling system to get more recycled content. So if that's our goal, to get more recycled content, then we need to make the recycling system more efficient, which is what we talked a lot about today with EPR and whatnot. I do think like we will not claim something as recyclable if the recycling rate isn't there. And we're seeing more companies do that, and we think that's the right thing to do, right? We don't see that everywhere, and maybe I don't think the Plastics Treaty will address this. It can't get everything. But we are seeing more green claims. Consumers are wising up to this. We don't think something should be claimed as recyclable if it isn't in practice in the location that you're operating in. And the same thing that's recyclable in one country isn't going to be recyclable in another country, and we need to consider that. So I think if we look at all that together, first we have to have truth in recycling claims, and then we need to look at how to fix the recycling system so that supply and demand is more balanced and recycled content isn't so much more costly than virgin.
Other respondents? If not, we'll go to our next questioner. And yes, okay.
Thank you. I'm with the Solid Waste Association of North America, SWANA. So we're a membership association of the municipalities and the companies that are actually collecting the recycling and sorting it to be recycled. So the choices brands make do play a big role in this, right? Because if a material is not designed to be recycling, it won't make it through that system. And if there's no end market, then we didn't really achieve anything by collecting it because there's nowhere to send it, right? So thinking about the voluntary actions and commitments by brands, there's quite a few of them, and they are making progress. But how does that kind of translate into supporting recycling more? And as we're talking about, Jessica said, in many areas recycling is working well, and we see that. I've been to many facilities where technology is very advanced. But how we know there are still gaps in many parts of the country. So how can these voluntary actions, of the brands, and maybe Jonathan can speak to this as well, of the activators, better support recycling throughout the U.S. so that we can really make those systems more robust?
Yeah. So on the voluntary commitment side of things, and it does have a tie to your question, and one of the key fundamentals of our work or our roadmap to circularity is a reduction in virgin plastic consumption. But on the flip side is an increase in recycled content incorporation to help increase and drive the economies of scale associated with being able to incorporate recycled content. And really, we have as a function of our roadmap, we also have our playbooks associated with recycled content incorporation that we provide broadly to the industry. And a key element of that is tied to the domestic sourcing. So to help make the pricing more aligned and to help make it more financially viable. And I have to commend all of our activators because they're voluntarily committing to this. Companies like those that are sitting on this stage with me have made that commitment and are making moves and are creating progress and are moving the needle. And that's what it's going to take in order for us to have that parity that you're both talking about here. It's through those voluntary commitments. So those companies that are part of the pact, they need to be celebrated because those, and the reason why we call them activators for a reason. They're activating the circular economy, and that's fundamental for us to make and create so we don't have the plastic pollution problem that we see.
Great.
And maybe just one other point that I'll add, because there's a textbook answer, right, that just says supply and demand, right? We've got demand up here for recycled content. there's not enough supply to fill that demand, the economics textbook says, oh, luckily our systems all somehow magically work out to ensure that supply meets demand, and then everything is great. We know that in reality, that textbook needs some help, right? And there's work that has to get done in the interim to ensure that catalytic capital or low-cost financing or flexible financing is provided to ensure that the infrastructure is created, especially if I just look at the US, 50% of the US doesn't have access to curbside recycling. Like, that's insane, right? So there are definitely places where we should be funneling and focusing capital, and we should be focusing resources and innovations to ensure that we have an equal playing field so that supply can meet demand. So I just bring that up because it's, again, easy to say demand from all the brands are up here for recycled content, supply is down here, it should naturally meet. We know at the end of the day, in order for that supply-demand curve to meet, we need the right infrastructure in place. We need to have the right messaging and marketing to ensure that we have materials that are actually recyclable being used in our system. We need to make sure that we have the right education, the right messaging, behavior change to ensure that people know what to use, where to put it, and what to do. So I bring all that up because there's a huge role for corporations, for nonprofits, for municipalities, and for financing institutions to come together to fill that gap and to accelerate that supply-demand curve hitting each other.
And Allison, did you?
Yeah, and I can point to two other voluntary commitments and voluntary initiatives that multiple brands and companies throughout the value chain have taken. So one is the Consumer Goods Forum's Golden Design Rules. So we got together and decided, here's some rules that we can all agree to make our products more efficient for the recycling systems. And we would like that to be mandatory globally, right? Because we know voluntary initiatives aren't enough. Then there's also the Ellen MacArthur Foundation's global commitment. And after 5 years, the commitment has really galvanized global action, and commitment signatories are outperforming the rest of the industry on every single metric. But it only covers 20% of plastic packaging. And that's why we really need this plastics treaty that we've been talking so much about. To get to that rest of the 80%, to even have a chance at ending plastic pollution, we need global mandatory obligations, including product design rules, including EPR, including financing, including reduction, including reuse, including recycling, including all these things to have a chance to end plastic pollution.
Thank you. Let's see. I see a couple of hands. Which way is our mic heading? Okay. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Thanks, Jeff and Newsweek, for pulling this together. I'm Brett Nadrich. I'm with Break Free from Plastic. We're a global movement, deeply involved in the treaty negotiations. I was in Ottawa, not in Busan. Thanks to you for those of you who are here. I know it's a long trip. I wanted to go back to something that Dr. Trisandi said about production caps, the need for production caps, and in particular thinking about two facts regarding plastics. One, more than 99% of plastics are made of fossil fuels. And two, we know that these plastics don't ever break down in the environment. They just break up into tinier and tinier microplastic particles, which are winding up in our body. They're winding up in the environment, in fish, and all throughout our body, right? So with that in mind, I'm wondering, Dr. Trisandi, if you could say a little more about the need for production caps.
Sure. So first of all, microplastics and nanoplastics get the biggest attention in the media right now around plastic pollution. But we know much less about micro and nanoplastic health effects than we know about chemicals used in plastic materials. So if I can make one comparison really quick, New England Journal of Medicine last year published a study finding microplastics in carotid arteries, the arteries in our neck, and linked it directly to heart disease. We had actually identified a couple years earlier that phthalates were directly linked not just to cardiovascular disease, but ultimately mortality in a large national population base. So I just want to be clear that the chemicals used in plastic, the science is about 20, 30 years ahead of the micro and nanoplastic science, and we need to focus where the strongest data are. So when it comes to production caps and what they do from a human health perspective, we're on an exponential growth curve when it comes to plastic production. There are three exceptions: 70s oil crisis, 2008 financial crisis, and the COVID-19 pandemic. Those were the only changes. And with that exponential rise, and we don't have the data to reflect this directly, but we've seen increases in chemical body burden. phthalates, bisphenols, PFAS, just to name a few, per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. Those are the forever chemicals in Mark Ruffalo's movie, The Dark Waters. If we don't have production caps, chemical levels in the human body will continue to increase, and will particularly continue to increase in low and middle income countries where chronic diseases are becoming the norm, just the way we started to see that in the past 30 years. And we will all pay as a society in human health impacts and costs to our economies. I mean, in most of the industrializing world, it's governments that are paying the healthcare dollar, whereas in the United States, we have a more diversified healthcare payer portfolio. So it's in those countries where they're going to most keenly see the impacts on their ability to become modern economies. So if we don't have production caps, we do not have improvements in human health, and those countries will not be able to grow into the industrialized entities that they should be.
Should also throw in a quick plug for the fence line communities that are near petrochemical facilities. It seems to me that's really the only policy lever that directly addresses the pollution burden that they're suffering.
And they're suffering it very acutely. You go to Louisiana and you see Cancer Alley right there with disproportionate impacts, and it's well documented, forgive me. I'm not sick, it's just a long-standing thing.
Because you're a doctor, we'll trust you.
Thank you. But suffice it to say that the air levels of volatile organic chemicals that are known carcinogens have been documented to be much higher in those communities, directly in proximity to the oil refinery that is going on.
Well, thank you so much. We are at our time. Those were fantastic questions. I know there were some hands up that we didn't get to your questions. I apologize, but maybe you can corner someone during the social hour. Thank you all so much for attending and for bringing those great questions. I'll tell you what, whatever you do for a line of work, if it doesn't pan out, consider journalism, because you guys are good questioners. Join me in thanking once again our excellent panel. Thank you so much. So we do have refreshments and some very interesting artwork on display over there. But before you go, I need to put in a quick plug for another event that we have coming up a little less than a week from today. It's called Better Workplaces, How to Foster Inclusion and Civility. That's Tuesday, December 10th. Panelists will discuss what to do when political disagreements spill over into the workplace, and how to maintain civility at work, even in these divisive times. So if you're in town, if you're available, please join us once again in this lovely venue for another event. We'd love to see you. And with that, I will bid you farewell until we meet again in the social area. Thank you all so much.